a quick intro, and then we'll turn it over to you. So Nemo, I'll hand it to you.
That sounds good. Okay. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nemo Suleiman. I am an associate here at Keystone, and I have been with the firm for almost 3 months. I'm also a graduate of Wellesley College, where I studied women's and gender studies. So it really is my distinct honor to introduce Professor Greer today. I had always wanted to take her class, and I've already told her this, but in particular, I wanted to take her African American and US visual culture class while I was studying at Wellesley. Many of my friends had taken her courses, and they would rave about the content and her teaching, but unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to experience it firsthand. So you can imagine how excited I am for her to be here with us today. By way of introduction, Dr. Brenna Greer is an associate professor in the Department of History at Wellesley College. She received her BA from Beloit College and her PhD from the University of Wisconsin. She is a historian of race, gender, and culture in the 20th century United States, where she explores the historical connection between capitalism, social movements, and visual culture. We are especially excited for her to talk about her research and experience. In particular, her first book represented the Black Imagemakers who reimagined African American citizenship, which examines the work of Black entrepreneurs in the World War II era who produced magazines, photographs, and advertising that forged a close association between Blackness and Americanness. She is currently at work on her second book, which examines the post-war development of Black commercial publishing and its significance within US culture and Black life, and we are all excited to read it in the future. Professor Greer has a lot to share with us today, so please save your questions until the end. In the meantime, feel free to jot your questions down or share them in the chat so Rachel and Liz can facilitate a Q&A at the end. And during the Q&A, please raise your hand and share your questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenna Greer.
Thank you so much, Nemo. This is such a nice way to end, as I said, Juneteenth Lollapalooza, to be on this Friday and to have a former Wellesley student do my introduction. That's lovely, and it was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to read that second book too. Who knows when that'll be? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully that will work the way it's supposed to. Everybody's seeing what they're supposed to. Okay, great, excellent. So I want to just thank Liz for reaching out and extending the invitation and recognizing that's on the behalf of Keystone leadership as well. And I really appreciate an opportunity to talk about Juneteenth, but use it as a jumping off place to talk about broader matters in race and Black freedom and Black citizenship. And we were talking beforehand how at first it seemed kind of unfortunate to have to, do a Juneteenth related discussion after the holiday. But I actually really think this is opportune because of the legislation that went through last week, making Juneteenth a federal holiday, which brings up more questions or shifts the significance and brings new questions to mind in terms of its significance. And I'm hoping to kind of prompt some of those questions. I will also say that I really, really do want to express appreciation for the interest in my work, my book. No one else who's asked me to talk on this subject has even I don't even think they've plugged in the book. So to have you, actually purchase it, and I'm happy to speak to, I can't imagine you've read it yet, but I'm happy to speak to any questions around the research in that. And I think you'll see overlapping themes here because it's what I do. So last week though, when the New York Times was reporting on the passage of legislation to make Juneteenth a national holiday, they also reported that few Americans know much about Juneteenth. And I think that's been my experience, particularly outside of African American families and communities. And I think last year, which I'll speak about a little bit more, last year, different circumstances came together to push Juneteenth to the fore. But I don't assume broad knowledge on Juneteenth, even among African Americans. Families or people, African Americans who celebrate Juneteenth, that's kind of come down through their family or unique community. So there should be no assumption among African Americans about the knowledge about the history. So my goal is to speak to the history. I'm just going to do a little history lesson and then use that to kind of broaden out. And so as I, you don't know this, but as I would always tell my students, don't worry really about the dates. I mean, I'm going to take you, worry about if you're in the 19th or the 20th, the 21st century, but it's really much more about story, and so that you can see some of the connections. And so my purpose is to provide some information about Juneteenth, but also really to hopefully give an expansive view of its significance, because my experience is that most people reduce it to a Black holiday or just like maybe a Black party even. But I really want to use my expertise as a historian to convince you of its larger significance, particularly as it relates to African Americans' freedom and citizenship throughout US history, not just during the period of Juneteenth. And I think that's what makes it relevant to any conversations about our current times. So to understand the history behind Juneteenth, you need to go back to the mid-19th century, and specifically the Civil War era. And in 1860, as the United States was moving closer to war, the population, the enslaved population in the United States was approximately 12% of the population was enslaved people of African descent. So about 4 million people across 33 states and 10 territories. And I want to just stop before I even go any further and draw attention to two things. One, if you look at this map, you can see that slavery is not just a Southern thing. That's an important thing to understand, and not something that many people understand. It's certainly concentrated within the South, but slavery was throughout the state and the territories at the time of the Civil War. The other thing that I really want to draw attention to, and this is something that I hope that you'll take away with you, is the use of my language. When not completely clunky, I choose to use the word enslaved instead of slave. Enslaved draws attention to a condition, right? A condition that was shared by millions of people of African descent, versus equating slave with Black, which those associations were used during slavery to justify slavery, but I also think that they have really undergirded racist ideas that come forward. So historians, US historians, historians of African American history and slavery really have tried to jettison wide use of slave in terms of talking about the actual human beings. So those are two things that I wanted to point out going forward. So if we go back to the mid 19th century, it's in 1861 that these longtime tensions over slavery did culminate in the Civil War. After 11 states, the 11 states here in red seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. And this is a new state that's dedicated to slavery and not surprisingly, white supremacy. Those two go hand in hand. So with the war well underway in January of 1863, then that's when you have President Abraham Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which I think most of us have heard about. And beyond freeing slaves in the southern states, this order was really significant when it comes just to the war, because the Confederacy was greatly weakened when deprived of this, enforced labor and fighting force that was their enslaved population. But that said, it still wasn't until April of 1865, so 2.5 years later, that Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. And Lee's surrender signifies the end of the Civil War. For historians like me, April 9th, 1865, that's the end of the Civil War. But it wasn't the end of slavery, and that's where Juneteenth starts to come into the picture here. So many slaveholders were desperate to hold on to slavery, right? We have to remember that enslaved people were property. So to lose that property is to lose a bunch of wealth and a way of life. And so many of them were moving west, and specifically they were moving into Texas, which was the most western slave state. So even after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after the Confederacy surrenders, you still have slaveholders trying to hold on to slavery. And going into the Civil War, the population, the enslaved population in Texas is about 182,000. And four and a half years later, it's 250,000, so 250,000. And that's largely because of this influx of slaveholders who are trying to outrun the Union Army and hold on to their property. So during and after the war, Texas is providing this refuge to slavery. And that's because, one, it's the most Western and there are the least Union troops there to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And then there's this idea, I think the popular story around Juneteenth, which anyone who knows anything about Juneteenth has probably heard, and I'm guilty of perpetuating it on some level in the past. There's this idea that Juneteenth is about the Union Army coming into Texas and telling the enslaved population that they were emancipated. And it is certainly the case that, there were enslaved people who did not know that they had been emancipated, right? We're not talking about an era in which there's communications on the level that we have now, but not even a rural postal service, or there's limited telegraphing, and that's not something enslaved people would have had access to anyway. It's more generally the case that Texas's enslaved population was attempting to realize their emancipation since 1863, but from a position of great disadvantage, to say the least. And so those are the circumstances leading into Juneteenth. So what is Juneteenth? Well, the title or the label, I'm sure you have figured out, is June combined with 19. And June 19, 1865, that's what it refers to specifically, is the date that federal troops under General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, actually on Galveston Island, and took control of the state. And the first order of business then, Granger's first order of business, was to issue General Orders Number 3, which proclaimed, most importantly, all slaves are free. It further said, this involves the absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. As a woman of color and as a historian, this period, we're launching into Reconstruction at this time, these types of declarations astound me. Right? I cannot imagine something so profoundly opposite of a previous, situation or scenario happening overnight, or the expectation that it would, but that was the case here. So the General Orders Number 3 declares Texas's slave population free, and in doing that, the Union troops in Texas on June 19, 1865, effectively bring an end to the institution of slavery in the United States. And that's an institution that dates back to 1619. And I'm sure most of you have heard about the controversy around the 1619 Project, the New York Times 1619 Project, and the lead author or organizer in that not getting tenure at UNC. That's what it refers to, is that date 1619. That's when the first African slaves, 20 African slaves, arrived in what we now call the United States. And so 6 months later then, in December of 1865, the necessary 27 states, 27 out of 33, three-fourths of the states, ratified the 13th Amendment, making it law, which then officially abolished the institution of slavery. Incidentally, Delaware, Kentucky, and Mississippi all rejected the 13th Amendment. And Mississippi only ratified the 13th Amendment symbolically in 1995, which I find interesting, shall we say. The following year in 1866, June 19, 1866, freedmen in Texas organized the first Juneteenth celebration. And freedmen is a term that's officially, that's the official designation of the formerly enslaved people. So I'll be using that term. And so these celebrations in their early days received the names Jubilee Day, right? Joyous, Emancipation Day, and Freedom Day. And those are still labels for Juneteenth that you'll see attached to different celebrations in different locations now. And so in the decades following the Civil War, then Juneteenth spread as freedmen migrated out of Texas and then throughout the South. And by the turn of the century, many of these celebrations became bigger and more produced, and then fancier even in some instances, as you can see with the carriage up top. I don't know if you can tell there, but those wheels are all decorated with flowers. And so people would decorate their homes, they would decorate themselves, they would decorate their vehicles, right? As part of this celebration. For a long time though, going into the mid 20th century almost, Juneteenth remained largely a Southern holiday, and it's still very much more known in the South. But as African Americans were moving in more numbers to the North and to the West, particularly with World War I and World War II, Juneteenth was moving as well and becoming more and more national or nationally celebrated, not a national holiday, but nationally celebrated. And then during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power era, Black activists were also holding events and promoting and popularizing Juneteenth and its significance. And those began initial attempts to make Juneteenth a national holiday that went essentially nowhere at that time. But it did draw more attention to the holiday among African Americans and among activist circles. Now, most cities in the United States, most major cities in the United States have Juneteenth celebrations of some sort. They still tend to be associated or located within Black communities or associated and organized by Black organizations or groups. And the way that a lot of people ask me how Juneteenth has been celebrated, I mean, there's an infinite number of ways, but there are some things that have characterized Juneteenth since 1866 actually. And those include food, always food, often in the form of a barbecue and actual barbecue, music accompanied by song and dance often, parades. Parades have been a part of Juneteenth since 1866. And then play or sport, rodeos are actually something that's common to Juneteenth in some areas, fishing, sack races, and then spirituality, prayers and hymn singing. And some African Americans actually make a pilgrimage to Galveston, Texas on June 19th. And then obviously, as it says here, kinship and community. That's because Juneteenth is really celebrating the perseverance and the togetherness or collective perseverance of African Americans. And so over time, now Juneteenth has expanded beyond parades and festivals and barbecues to include, as I said, there's a whole host of different activities that get associated or are organized in the name of Juneteenth, including beauty contests. That's a common activity associated with Juneteenth and has been since the early 20th century, having the goal of elevating Blackness and particularly Black beauty, and respectability, but always attached to raising funds for education, always making education central. And so as you can see here, it's the Miss Juneteenth Scholarship Pageant, right? And so there's also poetry slams, run walks, step contests, and then all manner of online and educational activities that have become part of Juneteenth. And also buy Black campaigns, like buy from Black businesses. So that in a nutshell is what Juneteenth, the history leading up to it, right? Very broad contours, and then how people have observed Juneteenth coming up through the 21st century. Again, really broad contours. And because Juneteenth has its roots in the emancipation of Black people, and Black people are primarily the group that have celebrated and embraced Juneteenth, which totally makes sense. I do understand why there's a tendency to reduce Juneteenth to a Black holiday, which it absolutely is, right? It's a holiday, but it is a Black holiday in that it is something rooted in the Black experience. But it is much more significant or bigger than that. And we can draw much more from the history. And so as a woman of color and as a historian of race in the United States, I really view Juneteenth as being more significant in its being a representation of a unique history of race, this nation's unique history of race, which will become a little clearer as I go forward. But then more precisely and somewhat ironically, given that it's a celebration of freedom, I think it's a symbol of the precariousness and instability of Black freedom. And I will also, I hope, make that more clear. And that's due to this anti-Black racism that, undergirded slavery and runs up through our current moment. And so I want to go a little bit deeper into that. So in the United States, Black people's freedom, equality, and or citizenship has never been fully or consistently granted, regardless of what the law is. And the fact that Juneteenth exists at all speaks to this. And that's where that precariousness comes in, right? Because even after their defeat, Confederates kept Black people enslaved. So what Emancipation Proclamation, right? But it's essential to note that Confederates, right, these racist white Southerners are not the only people who embrace or at least accept or tolerate slavery. And so to illustrate what I mean there, we need to go back to the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I think in the United States, many children are taught that Abraham Lincoln is the great emancipator because of the Emancipation Proclamation. I know that I was taught that in elementary school. But what most people don't understand is that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation freed, as I've highlighted here in yellow, quote, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Blah. What that says is that the Emancipation Proclamation emancipated only those slaves in Confederate states, and only those Confederate states that the Union Army did not have control of, right? Because, as I kind of implied before, the Emancipation Proclamation was first and foremost a war act. It was a strategy, a tactic that, as I mentioned before, greatly weakened the Confederacy. So contrary to what a lot of people believe, and almost all my students, when they come into college, the Emancipation Proclamation is not an anti-racist document. And in fact, President Lincoln he was not pro-Black. He was very much in support of exporting people of African descent back to Africa, free, formerly enslaved, whatever it be. What he was anti the institution of slavery. And that's not the same thing to be anti-racist. And so what the Emancipation Proclamation does for enslaved people in the Union states or the border states, nothing. They remain enslaved. That's the case until the 13th Amendment is passed, as I already discussed in 1865. So that's 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So for those 2.5 years, the Union Army is making use of an enslaved population to fight this war against slavery. All right, so in 1868 then, shortly following on the 13th, you have the 14th Amendment, which grants people of African descent citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment in 1870, which grants Black men the right to vote. And so in theory, as amendments to the Constitution, so as law, these 3 amendments guaranteed African Americans equal rights and opportunity, regardless of their past status of freedom or lack thereof. And in fact, following their passage during the Reconstruction period, African Americans, or at least some African Americans, did make considerable ground. And just before I move on with that, I want to be clear because I don't assume everyone knows. Reconstruction is the period from 1863, beginning of the Civil War, through 1877, when federal troops are occupying Confederate states to help those states rehabilitate and reintegrate into the Union, but also they're there to protect the rights of freedmen. Okay, so in terms of progress, the progress that African Americans or some African Americans are making, consider that during Reconstruction, numerous African American men actually were elected to office. And in fact, by 1872, so just 7 years after the end of slavery, more than 1,500 African American men held political office at either the local or the state level in the South. Now, that's another thing, as a historian and a woman of color living in the current moment finds incredible. And more remarkable, by 1875, so a decade after slavery ends, 16 Black men have been elected to Congress, including 2 senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. And just to put that in perspective, there have been 11 Black senators throughout US history, and 2 of them were elected in the decade after slavery. And 3 of them are serving right now. So that accounts for almost half the total number of Black senators in the United States, right? And so the political participation of African Americans, the ground that they gained there is remarkable in the post-emancipation decades. And where Juneteenth comes in there is that many African Americans took advantage of Juneteenth during those same decades to really showcase their progress in different ways, either in terms of class, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of education, and then also in terms of their political status. They also took advantage of Juneteenth, and this is true throughout the 20th century now, to showcase their patriotism. And I think that's something that some people really find surprising, but it's really important because Juneteenth has never been just about Black people celebrating freedom. From its inception, it has necessarily also been about Black people asserting their freedom and citizenship, right? And so that's where that patriotism piece comes in. It's my country too. This is national belonging. I am a citizen, right? And so from my perspective as a historian, it's nothing, and a woman of color, I just have to say that, it's nothing short of astonishing the rate at which and the extent to which Black Americans, particularly formerly enslaved Black Americans, worked to maximize their freedom and their rights following the end of slavery. But it's precisely their success in doing so that inspired a horrific backlash, particularly from white supremacists in the South, most notably former slaveholders, the elite Southern planter class. And so this class was called the Redeemers. That's not a historian's term. That was the terminology at the point in time. And the period after Reconstruction is called redemption, right? And so you have these former slaveholders who are determined to reassert white supremacy, redeem themselves, redeem the South, and to roll back Black freedom. And when federal troops pulled out in 1877, the way was cleared for them to do that. And so they used many tactics in their objective. One was Black codes. And this is a series of local and state policies that prop up all over the South that restricted Black from all manner of things. And that included loitering, being unemployed, owning property, bearing arms, miscegenation, but also just things like getting a haircut, playing baseball, right? They were random, from locale to locale. But besides limiting Black people's freedom, Black codes criminalized Black people for behaviors that were granted by their citizenship and that were common, among many, right? And I should say that loitering and disorderly conduct continue to be the primary reasons that law enforcement identify, approach, harass, and detain Black and brown people. And, I root these back into these policies, laws, customs, and practices that come right out of slavery or the post-slavery moment. In addition, Southern states drew up new constitutions and laws to disenfranchise Blacks by implementing poll taxes and literacy tests, which apparently I would fail right now, literacy tests, which for this largely impoverished and illiterate class, formerly enslaved people, that keeps them from being able to vote. They don't have the money or the education to be able to pass these barriers that are put before them. So then in the 1890s, these same states also implemented Jim Crow laws, which were foundational to the segregationist culture of the US South, but not just the South. And segregationist cultures that in some places continue to exist, or at least existed well up into the 1980s in a very formal sense. And then finally, the Redeemers relied heavily on violence to keep Black people, quote unquote, in their place. And so immediately after the Civil War, and I mean immediately, white supremacist militant groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Red League, the Red Shirts, White Man's League, formed for the purpose of terrorizing Black people, from restricting their freedom, both in terms of who they associated with, the fear of Black men being with white women, huge, not actually something that was happening, not on the scale that they thought it was. Job competition was something they were trying to curtail, and then political participation. And so this terrorism took many forms, including most horrifically lynching. And I think that most people think of lynching as being someone hanging from a tree, and certainly those are the pictures that we've seen most. But lynching technically is an extra-legal murder, so it happens outside the law, executed by two or more people. And so I'm not going to show you a lynching picture. I do not do that. I don't do it in classrooms. I do not do that. I've too often been the one student of color in a classroom where pictures of denigrated Black bodies are flashed on the screen. But I will show you this map to give you a sense of the concentration of lynching, right? And you can see how it's in those slave states, those former slave states. And during the 1890s, going into the turn of the century, 150 African Americans, primarily men, 150 African Americans were lynched per year, not during the decade, per year. So in the 1870s, Harper's Weekly published a political cartoon that was illustrating the state of Black freedom in this post-emancipation South, at least. And as you can see here, it says worse than slavery. That's debatable, but and you have these terrorist groups, kind of collaborating or uniting about this cowering Black family. And then commenting on these same circumstances, you had Black sociologist, historian, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois saying, quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." And I would argue that in truth, many African Americans, particularly many freedmen, hadn't had their moment in the sun, especially in the South. So you have to keep in mind that upon emancipation, most Blacks had no education, no resources, no land, no house, were separated from their family and had nowhere to go. And so those circumstances, combined with how the Black codes criminalized Black unemployment, pushed thousands upon thousands of Blacks into employment situations that closely mirrored slavery. And in many cases, formerly enslaved Blacks became sharecroppers. So they were tenant farmers who leased land from a landlord, which they paid for with money that they earned from growing crops on that land. And typically in the post-emancipation era, the landlord was their former slaveholder. So if we go back to General Order number 3, actually, right, this order that freed slaves in Texas, I'll ask you to note that it also advised freedmen to, quote, remain at their present homes and work for wages, and that they would not be supported in their idleness. So, right, this is kind of a mixed bag, this general orders, right? It's like you're free, but stay put, And so with no power to set prices for their crops or to reject those set by the landlord, sharecroppers typically became so in debt as to be working for free, or even worse yet, to be paying a landlord for the right to grow crops for that landlord, essentially. And so well into the 20th century, you have formerly enslaved Blacks trapped in these sharecropping situations in the South. And that includes my grandparents, William Greer Sr. and his wife, my grandmother, Marie Peoples. And so when people say, slavery ended 150 years ago, why are we still talking about it? For me personally, this is why, but also as a historian, right? Given the nature of sharecropping as I've described it to you, in a very real sense, I'm essentially one generation from slavery, even though I'm technically 3 generations away from slavery. But I'm really lucky because somehow, and I don't know the story behind this, somehow my grandparents managed to work another crop at night in secret and earn money, enough money to pay off their debts and migrate north, where they each worked 2 to 3 jobs into their 70s so that their children would go to college. My dad and his sister would go to college, which they did. And obviously that had bearing on my circumstances. But for many African Americans, their ancestors' inability to move out of sharecropping, domestic work, or unskilled labor positions, and the historical inability of African Americans to purchase homes due to discriminatory redlining, federal housing policies, those things have combined to systematically prohibit African Americans from accumulating the wealth necessary to educate themselves, to send their children to good or at least effective schools, to secure well-paying jobs with good benefits, to live in healthy environments, and to pass along assets to their descendants. And so this history helps explain how in 2017, the Boston Globe, the spotlight team at the Boston Globe did a study about the median net worth of people in the Boston area where I am by race. And they found that the median net worth for African Americans, an African American household, is $8. Now that was 4 years ago, but I can't imagine much has changed, particularly with a pandemic between now and then. And if you're curious, that's compared to $247,000 per white household. That's a 31,000% difference, right? And so this is profoundly problematic, which, I mean, obviously, but this is a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, it's not just laws that equate to or ensure freedom, or at least the feeling of freedom, right? Or the promise or the products of freedom, right? It's money, it's wealth in particular. Now, sharecropping largely dies out in the 1960s, but another vestige of slavery is alive and well in the 21st century and really relevant to our current moment. And that's mass incarceration, and particularly mass incarceration of Black people. And so by way of context, the United States is about 4% of the world population, but holds 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So that's disproportionately large, right? African Americans make up about 13% of the US population, but account for 34% of the US incarcerated population, right? Which I've already told you is disproportionately large. Now, some people are going to choose to believe that's because African Americans and apparently Americans are more criminal. But I would argue that systemic racism rooted in slavery accounts for the disproportionate imprisonment of Black and brown people. And when I say rooted in slavery, I mean that quite literally. And to make that clear, we need to go back to the 13th Amendment, which, as I've already said, abolished slavery, except that it didn't. Because Section 1 of this very short amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except as a punishment for a crime. Slavery is legal in the United States. And it's pretty impossible for me not to think that this is a very intentional loophole. But even if I don't go in that route, you have Black people having been the almost the entirety of the enslaved population in the United States for 200 years prior to the 13th Amendment. It is only logical that they would be the most vulnerable to this exception. And so this exception, given the numerous restrictions on Blacks after emancipation, those things combine to result in the immediate re-enslavement of many and a subsequent enslavement of many more Black people. Right, and it's this exception in the 13th Amendment that gave rise to the institution of convict leasing, which was and is a form of forced penal labor. And since the mid-19th century, convict leasing has predominantly ensnared African-American men, and as you can see here, boys. And historically, the primary function of convict leasing has been to provide forced free labor for state and private enterprises, and was a very Southern enterprise at first. It has moved west. But if you have an entire region of the country that has relied on forced labor, and then that labor is emancipated, it's not hard to imagine that another system is going to be quickly put into place to somehow acquire the necessary labor. So the value of this free forced labor fuels continued political and financial investment in this institution, which, as I said, is rooted in slavery and has come to rely on the incarceration of Black people. In addition to that, then in the 1970s, you had the war on drugs, which is initiated by the Nixon administration, which is carried up in terms of, sentencing laws, discriminatory sentencing laws, and drug policies to also translate or result in the incarceration of African Americans at a disproportionate rate. And in 1994, Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor admitted that the war on drugs was a racially motivated crusade, a crusade to criminalize Black people. He said, quote, "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, and vilify them night after night on the evening news," which they absolutely did. This is parallel to and totally coincides with and is connected to Black Power movement as well, right? And so this effort to criminalize these Black militant proponents of armed self-defense. And so these campaigns to criminalize African Americans have worked. And they've worked to the extent that in the 21st century, 1 in 3 Black men born in 2001 or later is likely to spend time in prison during their lifetime. There are more Black people in prison than there are in college. And so this is the state of Black freedom in the United States currently. And beyond depriving African Americans of freedom, this historic criminalization of African Americans is costing them their lives. And for the past year, the United States has been in this heightened state of racial unrest due to what a historian that I greatly admire, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, what she has termed as, quote, "cops' simple inability to stop killing Black people." And so now police brutality is not a new concern for African Americans. And for the past decade, protests have occurred in cities throughout the United States following police shootings or killings of unarmed, underage, mentally ill, compliant, indignant, innocent, and even sleeping African American men, women, and children. And since 2013, African Americans and their allies have organized against police brutality under the banner of Black Lives Matter. And I want to make the distinction. There is an official organization, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Black Lives Matter. But many people who are organizing under the banner of Black Lives Matter are organizing under the thesis that Black Lives Matter. So when people want to criticize Black Lives Matter, the organization, that's one thing. Then there's the thesis, the argument that Black Lives Matter. When you see all the signs in yards or people holding those banners, most of them are prescribing to the thesis. All right, last year, however, I would say was a tipping point on this score, right? And that has everything to do with May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man suspected of passing a fake $20 bill, was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin, who, as you can see here, with his hand in his pocket, casually kneeled on Floyd for an incredible 9 minutes and 29 seconds, ignoring Floyd's pleas that he could not breathe and ignoring bystanders' repeated calls to let Floyd up. And by day's end, a video of Floyd's arrest and murder went viral. And immediately after, then you had protests erupt all over the nation and all over the world. And compared to past protests, what's unique about these is that they were bigger, they lasted longer, they, again, were international, and the participation of whites was unprecedented. And that's something that I think there's potential there, right? And that's something that I want to come back to. In addition to protests in the street, an unprecedented number of corporations came out in support of Black Lives Matter. Again, I would argue probably the thesis and racial justice. And so I think the pronounced response to Floyd's murder had a lot to do with that video, right? But I also think we have to take COVID-19 into account. This past year, the United States, as is true with the rest of the world, has been plagued by this pandemic that has repeatedly exposed inequities in housing, healthcare, income, employment, that people of color and people living in poverty suffer disproportionately. And those are two overlapping categories. People of color and people living in poverty are greatly overlapping, I should say. And it's no exaggeration to say that these inequities, inequalities, and inequities have grave consequences. Again, at 13% of the US population, African Americans have accounted for 25% of COVID deaths. And so I think together these twin pandemics of police brutality and COVID illuminated both the nature and the extent of of systemic racism that African Americans and people of color experience daily, just as part of their lives. And these circumstances, I think, are what helped give new life to Juneteenth. Enraged by the circumstances of the last year and emboldened by promises of allies, African Americans last year seized upon Juneteenth for protest as much as for celebration. And that was new. Not that that hadn't happened before, but the extent to which it happened, that was new. And as part of their protest, they demanded recognition for Juneteenth and its significance. And in particular, they demanded that Juneteenth become a national holiday. And you need to understand, or I'll ask you to understand, that for many African Americans, Juneteenth is our Independence Day. Right? Every year on the 4th of July, the whole nation shuts down to commemorate that date in 1776 when the United States declared independence from England. But on July 4th, 1776, the preponderance of Black people in the United States, in the newly formed United States, would have been enslaved. They were on the verge of becoming 3/5 a person in a constitution that sanctioned slavery. And even if free, they would have been denied citizenship. That was a status that was only afforded white men at that time. So these are the historical facts that inspired journalist, activist, and also formerly enslaved Frederick Douglass to write his most famous essay, in which he asks, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" And he answers his own question. He says, quote, "It's a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham." Now, I'm not going to compare African Americans' current circumstances to those that Douglass spoke of in 1852 when he wrote this, right? Still in the midst of slavery. But given the continual denials of and infringements on African Americans' freedom and citizenship and rights, I do think it's a very fair question to ask, what to Black Americans in the 21st century United States is the 4th of July? And so that's where partly where this long-held objective among Blacks, there's this long-held objective to see Juneteenth become a national holiday, respected and in the same way that July 4th is for the broader American public. And so perhaps no one has been more dedicated to that goal than Opal Lee of Fort Worth, Texas. Now 94, every year for 40 years on June 19th, Opal Lee has made a pilgrimage of 2.5 miles to mark that 2.5 years between the Emancipation Proclamation and the emancipation of the enslaved population in Texas. In 2016, at 89 years old, she walked from Fort Worth to DC, in 2.5-mile increments. It took her from September to January, and she did this to draw attention to her campaign of making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And last Thursday, Lee, as I said, now 94 years old, had the privilege of being present when President Biden signed law into legislation making Juneteenth a federal holiday. If I'm honest, I think that he had the privilege of having her in his presence while she signed this legislation, but tomato, tomato. So this is a moment of great significance, right? And celebration for African Americans. But there's also, at least for me and people in my immediate circles, this question of now what, right? What does this actually mean in terms of the larger scope of racial equality or social justice, right? What does it mean for the Black lived experience? What does it mean for how broader America is going to view independence and freedom in terms of the Black experience? Because if you take nothing away from what I say today, it should be clear that when it comes to Black freedom, citizenship, representation, and recognition, nothing can be assumed or taken for granted. And I think what speaks to that, or where some of the anxieties are coming, at least for me, is I don't understand how the same body of government that passes this legislation currently has many members who are working extremely hard to restrict voting rights, which has always disproportionately affected communities of color, right? And also working very hard to restrict or prohibit discussions of race and really of racism. So for many I'll close by saying that for many African Americans, myself included, even as we're celebrating this turn of events, these are the questions we're asking. What does Black freedom look like going forward? And how does it actually look like freedom? How does it be realized as freedom? And those who are looking to be or who profess to be allies, these are the questions that you should be asking too. So I will leave it there. I will stop sharing so I can see everybody. I welcome questions. I love questions about anything. I need to see if anyone, let me open this up further.
I have a question, Professor. First off, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought that was fantastic and so informative and engaging. I was curious, and I confess I'm not a fast enough reader to have got through the whole book yet, but it's so clear your knowledge and research is so expansive and there's such a wide breadth. And I'm sort of curious what that process was like in writing your first book, and sort of if you knew that was the subject you wanted and were researching for years, or if you looked at all your research and sort of came to that. I would just love to hear a little bit of insight into kind of your research and writing process for that.
Yeah, no, that's, it's like I'm finally at a point where it's not just painful to talk about, right? When you would go home for holidays and people would be like, how's the book going? Shut up. You know? So, it was a very long process. It's not at all the book that I thought I would write. I started out, I have a master's in Afro-American studies, and during my master's, I studied Black women's activism in Montgomery, Alabama. And I thought that's what I was writing a book about. That's where I started. But as I say in the preface to the book, I wanted to know why these civil rights activists were presenting themselves as the way they were, like what their representation politics were. And when I started to study that, it took me to Black male capitalists. So I ended up writing a book primarily about Black male capitalists. No one was more surprised than I was, but I started my dissertation because it grew out of my dissertation, but it's very different from my dissertation. I started my dissertation in 2007, and this just came out in 2019. And part of that has to do with, I don't work very well without a deadline or being terrified. And so I pushed it right up to the 10-year clock. But I also had a baby and things like that. So, and working at Wellesley is just, I mean, Nemo, you know, it's a grind. The students are too smart. And so you're always just working to stay ahead of them by that. So it shifted, it definitely shifted. And the process was I love researching. I love it. Writing, not so much, particularly just if you don't have a schedule that allows for it, just kind of became tortured. So I think what people never realize is that a lot of people's first book, it's the book you have to write, and it definitely is in history. History is a book field. It's the book you have to write. You have to write it by a certain deadline. So it's never the book that you really want, although I really got about as close as I could. And that really surprised me. And you never write it in order. So I wrote the second chapter last, which is why it's the longest, because it never got edited, and stuff. And so, there was supposed to be another chapter, but again, 10 years. So, it's like this is what I tell my students, when you get a book, you should never just accept, right? It's on a market, right? I'm trying to get a job. I gotta produce something by a certain time. I gotta say something completely different than anyone else has said. So, right, that really shapes history. It really shapes knowledge. I think if you know someone who's written an academic book, any book, but an academic book, ask them about the book they wanted to write. Right? Ask them about the book if they had all the time in the world, right? And all the resources available, and there weren't any politics about it. Ask them the book that they wanted to write. But I do always tell people that I think a historian's first book is their autobiography in some way. And for me, the question that has underlay all my research, I realize now, was why do people look at Black people the way they do, right? And I mean that visually, but more so like, why are they receiving them in the way that they are, and in ways that are detrimental to Black people? And so the book is just a very academic way of engaging that question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Deadlines, yes.
I had a question as well. John Oliver had a segment where basically talked about why the history is not taught in American schools. The Black history, specifically African American history, is not taught properly in American schools. Like some of the stuff we talked about, like they mentioned, like the Tulsa massacre became popular after it came in the series Watchmen, which is so strange.
Yes. Well, I do. I may have said this to Liz. I've been working as a professional historian, like at Wellesley since 2011. No one has ever asked me to talk about or even teach Juneteenth. I've never, in 20 years of studying African American history specifically, ever had a lesson on it. Ever read about it in a book, ever had a lesson on it. So it is really remarkable to me how suddenly, it's just like, it's a holiday. It's a federal, it's remarkable that anyone's talking about it, but it's remarkable to me how quickly it became a federal holiday. It's also, as I implied at the end, a little concerning to me, right? Because that speaks to its being trendy. And when things become trendy, they go out of trend, right? And so the question is, how do you keep Juneteenth, again, as I said, not just about a holiday, it's institutionalized now, it's a federal holiday, great, but how do you use it as this opportunity, either as a day to advance Black freedom, or as a history to examine, to examine issues that bear on people, and not just Black people, like bear on Americans now, right? As opposed to it just becoming a day off where you have a barbecue, like July 4th is for many people.
Just to follow up, basically, there's a quote in Auschwitz and all the concentration camps. There's a quote by George Santayana: "Those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are bound to repeat them." So, what is the educational reform, which you kind of foresee to basically bring this into the mainstream? Right now, people are not even aware of it.
Yeah.
And then this gets hijacked by conspiracy theorists and all those people who kind of deny it.
Well, right. That's the thing right now that's really driving me crazy, and it's Friday, I have very low filter, but it is driving me crazy, this conversation about critical race theory, because one, they're not talking about critical race theory. Critical race theory is an academic legal framework that you only apply when you're a law student and thereafter, along with many other academic frameworks. So one, this is something that's just been pulled out of the air. And what they really mean when they are talking about it, those who oppose critical race theory, they're talking about discussions or history that are critical of racism, right? And so that those are conversations that are necessary, right? And we are doomed to repeat. It's not even that we're doomed to repeat, we're doomed to remain in the system that we are in now that allows for the systemic racism that the opponents to critical race theory would deny. But, right, of course, that serves them very well, right? It's not repeating, it's just we're gonna stay stuck in a place because the systemic racism, if you keep denying that it happens, it's so hard to undo anyway. Well, if you can't even try, then I think you're right. You know, that's why I think history is, I think people learning history and learning this history is so important. It's not just because I'm a historian, I teach it, but for me, when I went to grad school, when I went to the master's program, I called my brother and sister and were like, you guys, you have to do this. Like, it all makes sense now, right? Because I understand why things are how they are now and what the systems are. And that it's not necessarily maliciousness or something that is behind certain policies and practices now. It's ignorance, it's neglect, sometimes it's maliciousness, but often it's racism, right? It's racism, and that racism totally makes sense. It just totally makes sense. I don't like it and I don't want it, but it makes sense because of our history. So no, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Professor.
Of course, Professor.
Thank you so much, Brenna. We're just at time, so I want to be respectful of your time as well. And just to thank Nemo for your leadership in leading us off today. It was amazing. So thank you for that. And we hope to keep you in our kind of close family, Professor Greer, and hope to see you back with us sometime soon. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Bye, Nemo.
Thank you.